Cornwall is a unitary authority area and ceremonial county of England. Although most historians record that Cornwall had come under the control of the Kingdom of England by the time of the Norman Conquest, and the county was included in the Domesday Book, some nationalist activists, amongst other Cornish people, question the constitutional basis for the administration of Cornwall as part of England, arguing that the Duchy Charters of 1337 place the governance of Cornwall with the Duchy of Cornwall rather than the English Crown. These charters and various constitutional peculiarities related to the Duchy of Cornwall are claimed to distinguish Cornwall from England to such an extent that Cornwall should not be described as part of England in a constitutional sense. In ethnic and cultural terms, Cornwall and its inhabitants have at various times been referred to as foreign to England and the English people in various ways, including by the English themselves. One aspect of the distinct identity of Cornwall is the Cornish language, which survived into the early modern period and has been revived in modern times. Cornish nationalists argue, whether from a legal, cultural or other basis, that Cornwall should have greater autonomy than the present administrative circumstances give. A manifestation of this is the campaign for a Cornish Assembly, along the lines of the Welsh or Scottish legislative institutions. Those who assert that Cornwall is, or ought to be, separate from England do not necessarily advocate separation from the United Kingdom. An important aim is Cornwall's recognition as a home nation in its own right, similar to how Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are considered. History. Myth of origin. An ancient tale, the legend of Brutus, recounted by Geoffrey of Monmouth, makes explicit reference to a distinct origin of the Cornish people. The legend tells how Albion was colonized by refugees from Troy under Brutus, who renamed his new kingdom Britain, and how the island was subsequently divided up between his three sons, the eldest inheriting Loegria, the other two Albania and Cambria. In addition, according to the legend, a second and smaller group of Trojans arrived in Britain, led by a warrior named Corinius, to whom Brutus granted extensive estates. Just as Brutus had called the island Britain, and his companions Britons, so Corinius called the region of the kingdom which had fallen to his share Cornwall, after the manner of his own name and the people who lived there. Cornishmen. This indicates that, at least as far as Geoffrey was concerned, Cornwall possessed an identity distinct from the other parts of Britain. Prior to the Norman Conquest in pre-Roman times, Cornwall was part of the Kingdom of Dumnonia. Later, it was known to the Anglo-Saxons as West Wales, to distinguish it from North Wales, that is, modern-day Wales. The name Cornwall is a combination of two elements. The second derives from the Anglo-Saxon word wheelh, meaning foreigner, one who speaks a non-Germanic language, which also survives in the words Wales and Welsh. The first element, corn, indicating the shape of the peninsula, is descended from Celtic cernu, an Indo-European word related to English horn and Latin cornu. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a battle in 825. The Wheelers and the Defners fought at Gaffalford. Gaffalford is thought to be Galford near Lutrenchard on the banks of the River Lou, though some translations render it as Camelford, some 60 kilometers further west. References in contemporary charters show Egbert of Wessex granting lands in Cornwall at Kilkhampton, Rosmaker, Porton, Kyelwich, and Lawhitton to Sherborne Abbey and to the Bishop of Sherborne. All of the identifiable locations except Porton are in the far east of Cornwall, so these references show a degree of West Saxon control over its eastern fringes. Such control had certainly been established in places by the later 9th century, as indicated by the will of King Alfred the Great. Apart from the reference to Egbert's grant at port, and there is no indication that English rule extended deep into Cornwall at this stage, and the absence of any burghs west of Lidford in the Burgle Hidage may suggest limitations on the authority of the Kingdom of Wessex in parts of Cornwall. King Athelstan, who came to the throne of England in 924 CE, immediately began a campaign to consolidate his power, and by about 926 had taken control of the Kingdom of Northumbria, following which he established firm boundaries with other kingdoms such as Scotland and Cornwall. The latter agreement, according to 12th-century West Country historian William of Malmesbury, ended rights of residence for Cornish subjects in Exeter, and fixed the Cornish boundary at the east bank of the River Tamar. At Easter 928, Athelstan held court at Exeter, with the Welsh and West Welsh subject rulers present, and by 931 he had appointed a bishop for Cornwall within the English Church. The Bodleian manumissions, 2 to 3 generations later, show that the ruling class of Cornwall quickly became Anglicized, most owners of slaves having Anglo-Saxon names. Among those manumitting slaves in the Bodleian record are 4 English kings, but no Cornish kings, dukes or earls. It is clear that at this time areas beyond the core of Anglo-Saxon settlement were recognized as different by the English kings. Athelstan's successor, Edmund, in a charter for an estate just north of Exeter, styled himself as King of the English, and ruler of this province of Britons. Edmund's successor Edgar styled himself King of the English and ruler of the adjacent nations. Quote, "This was followed by King Ethel II describing Cornwall not as an English shire, but as a province or client territory." Surviving charters issued by the kings of England: Edmund I, Edgar, Edward the Martyr, Ethel II, Edmund II, Canute and Edward the Confessor record grants of land in Cornwall made by these kings. In contrast to the easterly concentration of the estates held or granted by English kings in the 9th century, the 10th and 11th century grants were widely distributed across Cornwall. As is usual with charters of this period, the authenticity of some of these documents is open to question, but that of others is not in any doubt. Some of these grants include exemptions from obligations to the Crown which would otherwise accompany land ownership, while retaining others, including those regarding military service. Assuming that these documents are authentic, the attachment of these obligations to the King of England to ownership of land in Cornwall suggests that the area was under his direct rule and implies that the legal and administrative relationship between the king and his subjects was the same there as elsewhere in his kingdom. In 1051, with the exile of Godwin, Earl of Wessex and his sons and the forfeiture of their earldoms, a man named Odda was appointed earl over a portion of the lands thus vacated. This comprised Dorset, Somerset, Devon and Wheelers, as Wheelers is Saxon for foreigners. This could mean West Wales, that is, Cornwall, or it could mean that he was overlord of the Cornish foreigners in Devon or elsewhere. Elizabethan historian William Camden, in the Cornish section of his Britannia, notes that, as for the earls, none of British blood are mentioned but one Lycandorus, who is accounted by the late writers the last Earl of Cornwall of British race. Norman Conquest, and after Cornwall was included in the survey initiated by William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England, which became known as the Domesday Book, where it is included as being part of the Norman king's new domain. Cornwall was unusual as Domesday records no Saxon burh. A burh was the Saxon centre of legal and administrative power. Moreover, nearly all land was held by one person, William's half-brother Robert of Mortain, who may have been the first Norman to bear the title Earl of Cornwall. He held his Cornish lands not as a tenant-in-chief of the king, as was the case with other landowners, but as de facto viceroy. F. M. Stenton tells us that the early Norman compilation known as the Laws of William the Conqueror records all regions under West Saxon law. These included Kent, Surrey, Sussex, Berkshire, Hampshire, Wiltshire, Dorset, Somerset and Devon. Cornwall is not recorded as being under West Saxon or English law. Ingulf was secretary to William the Conqueror and after 1066 was appointed Abbot of Croyland. When his church burned down, he established a fundraising committee to rebuild it. Ingulf's chronicle tells us, having obtained this indulgence, he now opened the foundation for the new church, and sent throughout the whole of England, and into lands adjoining and beyond the sea, letters testimonial. To the northern parts and into Scotland he sent the brothers Fulken, and into Denmark and Norway the brothers Swetman and Walson, while to Wales, Cornwall and Ireland he sent the brothers Augustin and Osbert. See Ingulf Chronicle of the Abbey of Croyland with the continuation of Peter of Blois, trans Henry T. Riley pp. 229–227. Henry of Huntingdon, writing about 1129, included Cornwall in his list of shires of England in his History of the English. On the Mappa Mundi, circa 1300, now in Hereford Cathedral, Cornwall is one of the very few regions within Britain to be named individually. The significance and relevance of this is unclear. The map belongs to a category of map known as complex world maps, and its depiction, within such a world context, should be seen in parallel with related contemporaneous material. The phrase England and Cornwall has been used on occasion in post-Norman official documents referring to the Duchy of Cornwall, extracted from a commission of the 1st Duke of Cornwall, 1351, 25 EDW. 3 to John Davenant, our steward and sheriff of Cornwall, greeting. On account of certain cheats we command you that you inquire by all the means in your power how much land and rents, goods and chattels, whom and in whom, and of what value they which those persons of Cornwall and England have, whose names we send in a schedule enclosed. William Caxton's 1480 description of Britain debated whether or not Cornwall should be shown as separate to, or part of, England. Tudor period. The Italian Polydore Virgil in his Anglica Historia, published in 1535, read that 4 peoples speaking 4 different languages inhabited Britain. The whole country of Britain is divided into parties, whereof the one is inhabited of Englishmen, the other of Scots, the third of Welshmen, the fourth of Cornish people, which all differ among themselves, either in tongue and manners, or else in laws and ordinances. During the Tudor period some travellers regarded the Cornish as a separate cultural group, from which some modern observers conclude that they were a separate ethnic group. For example, Lodovico Falia, an Italian diplomat at the court of Henry VIII, said, "The language of the English, Welsh and Cornish men is so different that they do not understand each other." He went on to give the alleged national characteristics of the 3 peoples, saying, for example, the Cornishman is poor, rough and boorish. Another example is Gaspard de Coligny-Châtillon, the French ambassador in London, who wrote saying that England was not a united whole as it contains Wales and Cornwall, natural enemies of the rest of England, and speaking a different language. His use of the phrase "the rest of" implies that he believed Cornwall and Wales to be part of England in his sense of the word. Some maps of the British Isles prior to the 17th century showed Cornwall as a territory on a par with Wales. However, most post-date the incorporation of Wales as a Principality of England. Examples include the maps of Sebastian Munster, Abraham Ortelius, and Girolamo Ruscelli, maps that depict Cornwall as a county of the Kingdom of England and Wales include Gerardus Mercator's 1564 Atlas of Europe, and Christopher Saxton's 1579 map authorized by Queen Elizabeth I, a miniature epitome of Ortelius's map of England and Wales, published in 1595. Names Cornwall. The same map displays Kent in an equivalent manner. Maps of Britain which display Cornwall usually in the legends do not refer to Cornwall, e.g. Lilly 1548. 17th and 18th centuries. Recognition that several peoples lived within Britain and Ireland continued through the 17th century. For example, after the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, the Venetian ambassador wrote that the late Queen had ruled over 5 different peoples: English, Welsh, Cornish, Scottish, and Irish. Writing in 1616, diplomat Arthur Hopton stated, "England is divided into 3 great provinces, or countries, every of them speaking a several and different language, as English, Welsh and Cornish. Wales was effectively annexed to the Kingdom of England in the 16th century by the laws in Wales's Acts chapters 1535 to 1542, but references to England in law were not presumed to include Wales until the Wales and Berwick Act 1746. By this time the use of England and Cornwall had ceased, because of the tendency of historians to trust the work of the predecessors. Geoffrey of Monmouth's semi-fictional 12th-century Historia Regum Britanniae remained influential for centuries, often used by writers who were unaware that his work was the source. For example, in 1769 the antiquary William Borlase wrote the following, which is actually a summary of a passage from Geoffrey. Of this time we are to understand what Edward I says, that Britain, Wales, and Cornwall were the portion of Belanus, elder son of Dunwallow, and that part of the island, afterwards called England, was divided in 3 shares, viz. Britain, which reached from the Tweed westward as far as the River Exe, Wales enclosed by the rivers Severn and Dee, and Cornwall from the River Exe to the Land's End. Another 18th-century writer, Richard Gough, concentrated on a contemporary viewpoint, noting that Cornwall seems to be another kingdom, in his Camden's Britannia 2nd ed. During the 18th century, Samuel Johnson created an ironic Cornish declaration of independence that he used in his essay Taxation. Note irony. His irony starts, "As political diseases are naturally contagious, let it be supposed for a moment that Cornwall, seized with the Philadelphian frenzy, may resolve to separate itself from the general system of the English Constitution, and judge of its own rights in its own Parliament. A Congress might then meet at Truro, and address the other counties in a style not unlike the language of the American patriots. We are the acknowledged descendants of the earliest inhabitants of Britain, of men who, before the time of history, took possession of the island desolate and waste, and therefore open to the first occupants of this descent. Our language is a sufficient proof, which not quite a century ago was different from yours." 19th century. Popular Cornish sentiment during the 19th century appears to have been still strong. For example, A. K. Hamilton Jenkin records the reaction of a school pupil who was asked to describe Cornwall's situation replied, "He's kidged to a foreign country from the top hand, i.e. it's joined to a foreign country from the upper part." This reply was heard by the whole school with much approval, including old Peggy herself. The famous crime writer Wilkie Collins described Cornwall as a county where, it must be remembered, a stranger is doubly a stranger, in relation to his provincial sympathies, where the national feeling is almost entirely merged into the local feeling, where a man speaks of himself as Cornish in much the same way that a Welshman speaks of himself as Welsh. Chambers' Journal in 1861 described Cornwall as one of the most un-English of English counties, a sentiment echoed by the naturalist W. H. Hudson, who also referred to it as un-English and said there were Englishmen in Cornwall who do not experience that antipathy, a sense of separation in mind from the people they live with, and are not looked upon as foreigners. Until the Tin Duties Abolition Act 1838, the Cornish miner was charged twice the level of taxation compared to the English miner. The English practice of charging foreigners double taxation had existed in Cornwall for over 600 years prior to the 1836 Act and was first referenced in William de Rotham's letter of 1198 AD, published in G.R. Lewis' The Stannaries. The campaigning West Briton newspaper called the racially applied tax oppressive and vexatious. In 1856 the Westminster Parliament was still able to refer to the Cornish as aboriginals, Cornish shires. Additionally, Cornwall was also divided into hundreds, which often bore the name of shire in English. In Cornish, they were called Cefrangau. Although the name shire today implies some kind of county status, hundreds in some English counties often bore the suffix shire as well, but where English shires were split into hundreds, each having their own constable, Cornish hundreds had constables at parish level. The Cefrangau were not, however, English hundreds. Trigshire came from Tricory, 3 war bands, suggesting a military muster area capable of supporting 300 fighting men. However, it must be said that this is an inference from name alone, and does not constitute historical evidence of any fighting force raised by a Cornish hundred. The Cornish Cefrang replicated England's shire system on a smaller scale. Although by the 15th century the shires of Cornwall had become hundreds, the administrative differences remained in place long after.